Well, thank you for joining us today for our virtual program presented by the Maryland Center for History and Culture Maritime Committee. This is our last program for the 2021 program season. I am Margot Capera, Public Programs Manager at the Maryland Center for History and Culture. Thank you again for everyone who has joined us today and those who have donated at the registration process. Thank you for your incredible support. Now, today's program, we will focus on the more neglected conversation around the maritime dimension of the Underground Railroad. And it will be moderated by Dr. Richard Bell, a professor of history at the University of Maryland and author of Stolen: 5 Free Boys Kidnapped into Slavery and Their Astonishing Odyssey Home. Thank you, Dr. Bell, for hosting this conversation today.
It is my pleasure, Margot. Thank you so much for this invitation to be a small part of this important conversation. And I want us to get into that conversation right away. The book we're talking about today is the fantastic new book, Sailing to Freedom: Maritime Dimensions of the Underground Railroad, edited by Timothy Walker, who is about to join us. Tim Walker is professor of history at the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth. He specializes in the maritime history of the early modern world and is the author of many texts, including the book Doctors, Folk Medicine and the Inquisition: The Repression of Magical Healing in Portugal During the Enlightenment. Welcome, Tim. And he is joined by one of his contributors in this book project, Cheryl LaRoche. Cheryl is my colleague at the University of Maryland. Cheryl is associate research professor. She works at the intersection of history, geography, archaeology, and historic preservation, and is the author, among other texts, of the book Free Black Communities and the Underground Railroad: The Geography of Resistance, an important book. Welcome to you, Cheryl. Welcome to you, Tim. I want to throw things open to both of you and just ask you, how did this new book, Sailing to Freedom, how did it come about? How did both of you come to this subject, the Maritime Underground Railroad?
Well, the book is born out of a series of National Endowment for the Humanities funded programs that happened in New Bedford, Massachusetts, where I lived. And it began about, a little over a decade ago, when the director of the New Bedford Historical Society, which focuses on the stories of people of color in New Bedford, approached me with an idea to explore a subject about New Bedford's role in the Underground Railroad, because a lot of people had ended up in New Bedford, people of color who were fleeing enslavement, and they ended up in New Bedford, and we wanted to tell that story. And so over the course of doing this program several times between 2011 and 2015, it became very clear that there was a neglected story of the Underground Railroad that we hadn't told yet. And that had to do with people fleeing from the far south by water, using ships and ending up in ports like New Bedford and other northern ports in free states where they could make a life and find a new life in freedom. So we began to pursue this idea, and I gathered together a team of scholars, including my colleague, Cheryl LaRoche, and we put together this book over the course of the last couple of years, and we're very happy to have it come out. But this is a story that really, historiography in the United States in the 20th century really didn't look at the maritime side very closely. And so we were hoping to bring that story and really make a fuller picture of what the Underground Railroad consisted of and the different methods by which people could achieve freedom by water rather than over land.
Well, you know, Rick, thank you for having us here today. I came to it from a very different perspective. In my book, I talk about the geography of resistance, and I had a number of things that I listed to look for if you're on one of these sites and are trying to investigate, particularly sites that hadn't been documented before in the Underground Railroad. And one of the things that I said was that it should be located near water. These churches that I look at are often sitting on cliffs or hills or mounds above the water. And so the water was always a component of my research. I was always standing on the edge of the Ohio River, the Mississippi River, the Susquehanna River, the Potomac. I was always there. So when Tim contacted me, I was a bit reluctant because I understood this sort of across the country, but then needed to narrow it down to focus in on Maryland and the Chesapeake Bay, which I would say the study in the book for me is a introduction. It's the beginning, not the end of the subject, but always had noticed it. So when he called, I was like, well, I know this is a component. I have countless examples. And so it was great to participate and bring this component, this aspect of what I would say is a very well-known but under-theorized and misunderstood component of American history.
I'm so glad you raised the Maryland connection there, Cheryl. People in the chat are already starting to talk about that, and we'll turn to Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman a little bit later on. First, though, for folks who are coming to this subject fresh, this Maritime Underground Railroad, which you also call in the book the Saltwater Underground, tell folks what exactly that was and what's important, what's distinctive about it.
Well, I'd very much like to do that. And I also want to thank the Maryland Center for History and Culture for having us. And it's a great opportunity for us to talk about this subject that is so understudied. And as Cheryl LaRoche has mentioned, there are all these examples that crop up through a variety of means in the historical documentation. But until now, people have really focused on the sort of land-bound terrestrial components of the Underground Railroad. So what I'd like to do quickly, I'm going to share my screen and provide some images that that will help me to explain this story and give us a sense of some of the important components of the argument that we put forward in the book. So here's the cover, Sailing to Freedom, Maritime Dimensions. And this is a map that sort of encapsulates how the Underground Railroad is typically taught in the classrooms of the United States. And so we see these long lines of escape routes heading from the very deep south, even as far south as New Orleans and so on, and central Alabama and Mississippi and Georgia, all the way up to these free states. But the problem with this map is that the way this is represented gives us a kind of false picture. The overwhelming majority of documented successful overland escapes actually begin very, very close to the border with free states. And so this map sort of distorts the true story of the Underground Railroad because the overwhelming majority of people are actually escaping from Maryland, Virginia, Kentucky, Missouri, very close to free states. And while we do have a representation of people escaping by water from the far south, the far coastal south, it didn't show up a lot in the historiography. So the key thing to remember is that in the far coastal south, the overwhelming majority of dockside work and waterfront workers are all enslaved, mostly males, but they're an enslaved population that is working in the maritime industries in the South. They are loading and unloading ships. They are doing all kinds of harbor and river labor on board vessels, and they're learning a lot of information about how the maritime industries work and about the rhythms of the sea and how navigation functions. So for example, they're working as dock and wharf workers, they're longshoremen and stevedores, they're warehousemen, drovers and teamsters bringing supplies and materials to the ships in the harbor. They're doing a lot of the maintenance work on ships in the harbor, doing the rigging and the caulking and so on. And so the waterfront workers are overwhelmingly an enslaved population. Beyond that, though, the watermen themselves, who are working on ferries, working as fishermen, they are deckhands. Some of them are even skilled pilots, taking boats around navigational hazards in the harbors of the South. These are also roles that are filled and performed by people of color. And this gives them a kind of strategic knowledge about the sea that they can then leverage and use to run away and achieve freedom. So if we use South Carolina as just an example, you can see that the concentration of enslaved people is very much close to the coast, and all of the plantation and agricultural produce that is made here in the lowlands of the Carolinas has to be brought down to the harbors and these river systems and these tidal riverways. That's all being done by enslaved watermen to get the goods from the interior to the harbors and then loaded on vessels. So this gives them a lot of knowledge about how the sea works. The other way that we know about this is in our historical record with primary and secondary source documents. In secondary source documents, 70% of all of the published escape narratives by people who achieve freedom, 70% of them mention maritime escapes as a means of achieving freedom. But beyond that, we can look at runaway slave advertisements and other kinds of public information that pointed out how people had made their escapes. And so typically a runaway slave advertisement will have which is placed by the owner seeking to recover lost property. They will put a tip about how they think their property absconded. And so here's a great one from 1772. As he has been used to the sea, he will probably endeavor to get aboard some ship and make his escape out of the colony. All masters of vessels are therefore forewarned from harboring or carrying him off at their peril. So this is in the late 18th century. No less a person than George Washington's enslaved woman, Oni Judge, also escaped by water. And he notes this in the advertisement that he placed, trying to get her back. I just want to move on to, this is a wonderful broadside advertisement from the Maryland Center for History and Culture's collection. And this is a broadside looking for a man named Jack. His object is to go to sea, and he will be trying to ship on board some vessel. All masters of vessels and others are forewarned, harboring or taking off said Negro at their peril. So over and over again in the historical record, we see these references to maritime escape, and yet they somehow haven't found their way into the historiography of the 20th century. Cheryl, I believe you wanted to make a comment on this one as well.
Yeah, I did want to comment on this particular ad for Marylanders. You'll see that it's placed by Patterson, and he's at Gunpowder Falls. So many of I spoke and concentrated on the Chesapeake because that was just sort of the larger narrative, but all of the tributaries coming into the Chesapeake Bay also need to be looked at, including the Gunpowder. We don't talk a lot about Annapolis. It's sitting right on the water. It does not have a strong Underground Railroad narrative, in part because it's the capital. This is a slave state, but there are all of these tributaries, and any place that touches the waterways of the Chesapeake, we should be looking at for Underground Railroad narratives and escape, or, saltwater escape, as it were. So yes, thank you.
So one other kind of advertisement I'd like to draw our attention to, and that is an advertisement placed by the master or captain of a vessel who has arrived in a northern port with a contraband escaped fugitive slave on board. And this is from 1797. It's a newspaper published in New Bedford in Massachusetts. And what we have here is a really fascinating document, because after 1793, there's a Fugitive Slave Act that actually applies penalties to masters of vessels who knowingly assist in the escape of fugitive slaves. So what that required them to do is, if they found themselves in a northern port with a fugitive on board their vessel, they had to give legal notice of that in order to provide the owner of the slave with a reasonable opportunity to recover their property. But what this was really doing is giving legal cover to the master of a vessel. And so it's fascinating to read, and there are many of these kinds of ads in northern newspapers. So it says, I'm William Tabor, commander of the sloop Union that sailed from the York River in Virginia on the 28th of March last, bound to this port, New Bedford. That on the day after sailing, I discovered a Negro on board said sloop who had concealed himself unbeknownst to me. We don't know if that's true or not, but we have to, we assume that he's being forthright in his description. It appearing, and this is where it gets really interesting, it appearing inconsistent for me to return, the wind being ahead. So he says, I couldn't turn around. The wind was not with me, so I couldn't take him back. I proceeded on my voyage and landed him in this port, New Bedford. He calls his name James. Is that his real name? We have no idea. He's about 27 years old and says he belongs to Mr. Shackelford, a planter in Kings and Queens County, Virginia. Is that accurate? We have no way of knowing. Any person claiming him will know by this information where he is. So these kinds of newspapers circulated up and down the coast. These notices were reprinted in other newspapers. So eventually, Mr. Shackelford is going to find out that his property, the person who calls himself James, is in New Bedford. But these were weekly newspapers. And so it's going to take some time. And eventually, whenever Mr. Shackelford finds out, James could be anywhere. And that was understood. Final couple of slides I'll give you is that we have published accounts of fugitive slave narratives. This is a very well-known one. Thomas Jones, who sailed from Wilmington, North Carolina, and then made his escape in the harbor of New York because the shipmaster was going to try to have him re-enslaved and taken south. And then we also have a whole body of laws and ordinances passed in port cities in the South that tried to stop this sort of sieve of runaways getting on board northbound vessels and going up the coast. And so we have commissions and agencies that are empowered to board vessels, to search vessels, to fumigate vessels. And we also have a bunch of ordinances that were meant to control free Black mariners when they were in southern ports. And so they were often kept on board their ships. They were not allowed to be landed, or in some cases, they're even incarcerated in a southern port until their ship leaves, because they didn't want free Black mariners encouraging enslaved Black dock workers to run away. So these are the main arguments of the book. And I'll hope that this inspires some really interesting conversation and discussion that I'm looking forward to. So thank you.
Thanks for that, Tim. And speaking of interesting discussion and conversation, I want to remind folks out there watching, we have an enormous crowd watching today, that there is a Q&A button somewhere on your screen. For me, it's at the bottom. If you have questions for Tim and Cheryl, don't hesitate to post them in the Q&A box. And also, I just want to highlight the one thing, a book that an enslaved woman who ran away from George Washington that Tim mentioned in passing, Oni Judge or Ona Judge. She's been the subject, as many of you know, of an excellent recent book called Never Caught by Erica Armstrong Dunbar. If you've not heard the story of Ona Judge's successful attempt to escape George Washington's enslavement, do check out that book, Never Caught by Erica Armstrong Dunbar. So I want to skip forward a little bit. I was going to ask you about scale of this and about sources, but I think, you've been able to sketch out some of those answers. So I want to turn to Maryland, Cheryl. Two of the most famous, the greatest Marylanders we talk about in the 19th century are, of course, Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman. How did the maritime underground impact their fugitivity?
Well, if we begin by thinking about Frederick Douglass, of course, we know he's a waterman, we know he's a caulker, we know he is familiar. We know that he sees these ships, and when he first leaves the Eastern Shore, he's put on a ship and he's starting already to imagine freedom based on water schooners, vessels. And even though his first attempt at a planned attempt to escape fails, it was going to be by water. And so the recognition of the expediency that water provides is something that people who are escaping understand. But there's also, of course, the difficulty of obtaining passage in the ships and so forth and so on. And even when Douglass finally does escape, even though the narrative is by rail, we're always confronted. There's only a narrow strip in Maryland that you can actually walk all the way out of slavery. Otherwise, you must cross a body of water, whether it's the Ohio, it doesn't matter. With Tubman, and there's so many things about Tubman that I find completely intriguing. And one is that this woman may not have been able to read or write, but she certainly did understand human beings. And I think the reason why she's so successful is because she knows exactly how to play what's going on And as you know, she takes this woman Tilly out of slavery, and she comes down the C&D Canal, which is a space that I speak about in the article, because the canal is very important to passage, whether it's for the Pearl or whether it's for Tubman. Tubman comes down and gets into Baltimore in the C&D Canal. But then when she takes Tilly, she travels south. And this is classic Tubman rather than north. She comes down 40 miles out of her way down the Chesapeake to the Nanticoke River, and then takes another, 64 miles up the Nanticoke River to go into Delaware, then to walk, then to take a train. So she's used every form of transportation that we know of in escaping slavery. And so when we talk about the Underground Railroad, she's on the ground, she's on the water, and she's on the trains. So that it's a wonderful story for really providing an example, a full example of how these things all work. Oh, somebody just mentioned John Crichton. Yes, God rest his soul. So it's one of the classic stories that illuminates how these things work. She's picked up by a conductor who helps her along. So it's a way to understand that Maryland and the Bay in particular is an expedient form of passage. The other thing I'll say, particularly about Tubman, but in general, and in response to a question you asked earlier, the waterways, of course, you need a boat. So that's number one. You can't just leave. You have to plan a little bit. You need oars, boats, winds, get steam. You need to get out. But it's also a means for transporting large numbers of people. So there's something like the escape on the Pearl, or even Tubman's, we don't usually talk about it, but even her Combahee River escape, that's 700, almost 800 people. Waterways provide that. And the other piece of expediency is that you can get small children out of slavery. You can get women out of slavery. You can get people out of slavery who can't walk. So that's the other piece to really understand about the difference between maritime escapes and overland escapes. And you know, dogs cannot trace you on the water.
Right. I'd like to jump in there because that's a really important point. The logistics of escape by water are so much simpler than trying to escape overland, because if you're going overland, you have to organize food, you have to be hidden, you're on land, you're constantly under observation, and in the South, you're under observation in a place that is already hostile to people of color who may or may not be traveling without any kind of pass or permission to travel. And there were organized slave catching groups that were out patrolling for runaways. By contrast, if you are able to get aboard a northbound ship in the 19th century, the arm of the law, the authority of the United States federal and state governments only extended 3 miles out to sea. So almost immediately, as soon as vessels cleared harbor, if they were northbound, they weren't subject to search and seizure if they were in international waters. The other point is that anyone getting aboard a vessel and is stowed away or with the knowledge of the crew, they had nothing to do except to ride the winds and the Gulf Stream north, and it was a relatively quick journey. You could be from Charleston, South Carolina to New York City in a matter of days, certainly under the best conditions, under a week. And so it's a much, much easier, logistically less hazardous means of escape. And so many people in the coastal far South fully realized this because they were completely comfortable and aware of the volume of commercial traffic going between northern and southern ports. And so because of that, it just made logistical sense. It made sense from the point of view of the danger of recapture to get aboard a vessel and end up in a northern port within a matter of days.
And let me just interject there to say, first of all, Cheryl, I'm reminded as you were talking about Tubman and Douglas there, that in the chat, I'm starting to see some of the people who've shown up to hear this talk, and I can find one biographer of Frederick Douglass, John Muller. I can find one biographer of Harriet Tubman, Kate Larson, listening to us today. Hi to all of you who know a ton about this stuff. Let's pick up on that theme Tim just raised there. On the one hand, it sounds like this saltwater underground is full of opportunity and is some ways more accessible to people seeking freedom. But of course, as you referenced in your slide presentation, Tim, the amount of surveillance and restriction and reaction and backlash is also significant. Can you talk a little bit more about these fumigations and Negro seaman laws, etc.?
Yeah, and I'd like to invite Cheryl to jump in on that too. So the Southern owner class fully understood that this was a problem, that there was a major loss, and this represented, so people fleeing through the ports and from the waterways of the far South represented a huge loss in terms of capital, because of the value of people who were absconding, but also a loss to productivity and to the labor. Sometimes people who were of extraordinary, they had extraordinary experience and knowledge aboard vessels that had come at a cost. People were trained up to work on the waterways, and they were the most likely to be able to successfully escape by water. So because of the full knowledge that this was happening, Southern municipalities, Southern states, beginning in the early 19th century, start to enact laws to try to stop this loss. And it included creating, first of all, very draconian penalties for helping people to escape by water. Northern captains, if they were caught, they risked the loss of their vessel, which they often owned. And so this was an enormous penalty to suffer. Or they certainly risked also being forbidden to trade in Southern waters, or being barred from trading in some ports if they were captured doing this. For African people of African descent, especially free blacks living in the South, the penalties were sometimes capital punishment. This was an offense for which people would be executed, and so the penalties are very high. In terms of the structures created to try to stop the loss, to stop fugitives, there are stations set up to burn sulfur and other kinds of noxious fume-producing substances below deck in order to drive out anyone who might be hidden in a vessel, and that had it had some tendency to be effective, although there were ways to avoid that if you were hidden below deck. There's at least one captain that William Stills writes about in his book. He doesn't name him until later. Subsequent research has figured this out, but there's a captain using a schooner called the Richmond that made numerous trips up and down the coast, carrying persons of color to freedom. And at least one occasion, the ship underwent a search when there was more than 20 people on board, and those people were not discovered. They managed to get them out into safety. So this is an extraordinary story, and it's one that I think that because most of us don't think about the importance of maritime commerce and the maritime dimension of the US economy during the 19th century, we tend not to think about just how, on one hand, how big an opportunity this represented for people seeking freedom, but we also don't think about just the sheer amount of commerce that's being carried between the North and the South during this period of time.
Yeah, you know, one of the things I tell my students is that laws tell us what's possible. You know, we never had any laws about texting and driving until we started killing ourselves by trying to text and drive. So when you look at the number of laws, when you look at the Fugitive Slave laws, all of these laws are telling you the magnitude of the problem. We don't understand the volume of it because we can't give you specific numbers because those are hard. We can speculate, but we can talk about the magnitude of the problem because of the scale of the laws. So we're seeing people trying to regulate this behavior, both on land, with all of these various fugitive slave laws that are coming up, not just the big ones, but the small ones that we don't even talk about, and then the regulation by sea. It's surprising to me now that we've done the book, given all of these examples, that it's taken us to 2021 to actually speak about it in this, we speak about it individually, but in this larger collective way.
I want to turn that into a question, Cheryl. I think that's so important what you just put your finger on there. And, you know, we're dancing around this issue of visibility here, right? Because my sense is whether we're talking about the familiar Underground Railroad over land or this, to many of us, unfamiliar maritime Underground Railroad, people at the time knew this was going on.
Absolutely.
You can see this in the laws they mobilize in response, etc. It doesn't mean these things weren't furtive and secretive. They, of course, were. That's the nature of escaping slavery. But this is, as you put it, a problem that everyone's aware of. So if it was a problem everyone was aware of, why have we forgotten in the last, 150 or so years, just how vibrant a maritime Underground Railroad there was? I know both of you have thoughts of this. Can I start with Cheryl?
I have thoughts, and I'm sure your subscribers and people that are here have other thoughts as well. But the two greatest books that come out are about the Underground Railroad on land. Even though they speak about sea, they don't speak about it collectively. So that's one thing. We start out with a narrative that's basically land-based. And because for the land, we know there is often this connectivity. You go from one place, point A, to point B, you're handed off to point C. On the water, we don't have that many kinds of interactions. You get on the ship, even with Tubman, you get on the ship, you get off, you have some interaction, but perhaps not as many as you're going to have on the ground. And even though Still mentions numerous examples of water escapes or people on ships or people shipping themselves, he doesn't speak about it in the collective way in which he speaks about land-based escapes. And so I think all of these things have contributed to not feeling like there was, quote unquote, a network, which people seem to think about the Underground Railroad, although that is somewhat of a misnomer. There isn't this collective understanding of cooperation on the sea.
I would agree entirely with what Cheryl just said, and I might even take it a step further to say that many of the escapes initiated by water, and this raises the question of agency. Southern dock workers and Southern mariners, watermen, who understood the ocean and could use that strategic knowledge to effect their escapes, did it on their own. They did it on their own. They used and leveraged their own skill and knowledge to get aboard a vessel and go north. And so they often sort of bypassed much of the infrastructure, if we can call it that, of the Underground Railroad. And they only really engaged with it once they arrived in a free port in the north. And so this really speaks to the initiative and the undertaking of persons who had gained this strategic knowledge that someone working on in an area just a little bit inland, someone working as an agricultural worker on a plantation, or working in any kind of enslaved capacity in the interior, just a few miles in the interior, would not have had those kinds of skills, nor would they have had the opportunities. And so when we talk about the Underground Railroad, insofar as it happened in the South, yes, there were cases of some persons who were helped to get on board vessels by people sympathetic to the abolitionist cause. But in most cases, it seems to be people who are already engaged in maritime work and find their way aboard vessels. And then in many cases, in places like New Bedford, they continue to engage in maritime work once they are in a capacity of being a freedman or a freed person. So that's one thing to say. The other thing I would say is that in terms of historiography, the story of the Maritime Underground Railroad is there in the 19th century. If you look at William Siebert's book, and I found it very instructive to go back and look at these early sources on the Underground Railroad. So Siebert's book comes out at the very end of the 19th century, I think it's 1898, And he talks a lot about maritime escapes. And in fact, some of the best illustrations that we've used in the book are taken, they're etchings and engravings taken from his book that show very clearly episodes of maritime escape. And so the question then is, why does this change? What changes in the 20th century? And I think what changes is we begin to look, as a nation, we begin to look away from the sea. We begin to appreciate much less the maritime component of our own history. We have an interstate highway system that focuses us on terrestrial travel rather than maritime travel. And so we just sort of, the appreciation of the nautical side of our history drops out. And furthermore, very few historians are trained nowadays with an appreciation of the maritime component or maritime dimension of American history. So I think that has a lot to do with it. I think that's changing, and I think works like ours are beginning to change that perspective. But I think we went through a period where maritime history had kind of fallen out of fashion, and consequently people focused on the terrestrial side of the Underground Railroad.
Plus, Tim, I think there's 100 years from roughly 1898 to 1998 where the Underground Railroad is, it's not a subject that historians trust. It's not a subject that people believe. It's really been mythologized. It's been downplayed. And until Bloxham really comes out with his National Geographic article, and then the Park Service gets involved, the whole topic, whether it's on land or on sea, is something that historians do not want to touch. No credible historian wrote about the Underground Railroad. And let me, not such sweeping, that's too sweeping a term. There were few credible historians who wrote about the Underground Railroad before 1998. And when you look in the index of many important books, the subject is, it's got one entry. When you go to study people that we know were operating on the Underground Railroad, their biographers don't touch that topic. I just finished talking about this with another people who were thinking about this. And I'm looking at some very famous people that I know, I can see that they have involvement, but because they were laudable, because they were important, because they were distinguished, people didn't want to associate their heroes with illegal activity. So there's a lot of reasons why we come to this moment, I would say.
Cheryl, speaking of subjects that historians do not want to touch, what about the term Underground Railroad? Is that sacrosanct, or is it really at this point not terribly hopeful in capturing the multiplicity of experiences and fugitivities that we can put under that general heading? It seems to draw our attention in some directions while obscuring our attention from looking in other directions. What do you think?
First of all, I think that that fictional book by Colson Whitehead, where people were asking me about underground trains, and that people believed he did such a good job, people believed him. So I think that the term has gotten a little bit debased just from the fictionalizing of what's been happening. That's kind of undermined the credibility of what we're talking about. I think it's an iconic term. I think that we've taken other icons down, and we can take this one down if we need to. I think the saltwater underground, which is kind of a, it's an anomaly. It's often, doesn't quite work together, is a term that might suffice, but there's a lot of romance. The Network to Freedom is based on this Underground Railroad idea, and because the idea of the underground, this is an interesting. I like this question. I just want to answer it. I hadn't thought of this before. What the Network to Freedom did was expand the definition of the Underground Railroad to move it to escape from slavery. No matter how broad, from the first landings on the shores of this country to, into Juneteenth, all of these things, whether they were assisted escapes or not, whether they're inside the classic period or not, got subsumed under the title Underground Railroad, rather than come up with a new term that would encompass all of these escapes that we're talking about. So we have expanded the definition rather and to include all of this, rather than give a new phrase for the redefinition.
And let me just pick up on that, Cheryl. I think that's a wonderful reminder, folks. You called it the classic period, 1840 to 1860, the Underground Railroad. William still in Philadelphia and other agents around the country, often living quite near to real railroad depots, right? But of course, what does that obscure? What does that obscure? It obscures everything we're talking about in this conversation about the maritime underground. It obscures Black refugees moving towards the British Army in two big wars, the Revolution and the War of 1812. It obscures the Union Army as an agent of and locus of fugitivity in the Civil War. It obscures self-emancipators, people who don't get any help from anyone as they make their path to freedom, of course. So we could debate whether this term is useful or not. Tim, let me turn to you for one more question before I then turn to questions from our enormous audience, and questions have been pouring in. This book has an Atlantic focus, partly by virtue of its origins with the NEH seminar you guys ran. What do you think is next for scholars of the maritime underground? Where will we be 10 years from now?
So I want to hasten to say that in the introduction to the book, which I penned, I do a small literature review to talk about some of the previous scholarship that did touch on maritime components of the Underground Railroad, but they often did that as kind of a I won't say an afterthought, but a much smaller component to the main study that they were doing. But it's not like it was completely absent from the historiography. In fact, the term saltwater underground, I think, is the title of a chapter in Fergus Bordewich's book, if I'm not mistaken. But so what's next? We specifically left out, because we had to draw the parameters somewhere, and we decided to focus entirely on the eastern seaboard of what is the United States. But that leaves a lot of opportunity for future scholarship. I would, as you may or may not know, I spend a lot of time working in early modern European colonial historiography, and so I work a lot with the Portuguese. So what's going on in Brazil? I'd love to know about escapes out of colonial holdings that are not United States territory. What's going on in the Caribbean? There's a lot to be written about the Gulf Coast, for example, and people escaping out of the port cities along the Gulf of Mexico southward towards Mexico, which after 1836 was, and maybe even before that, was a territory that did not have legal enslavement. And so that's fantastic. There are people escaping south from Florida and from Georgia and from the region around the peninsula of Florida into the Caribbean, where there were some areas where enslavement had been outlawed by the first half of the 19th century. So there's a lot to be said there. Another focus, so I was born in Detroit and I grew up in Ohio, and my upbringing was steeped in stories of the Midwestern Underground Railroad stories and lots of crossings of the Great Lakes. This could also be included in the Maritime Underground Railroad under that umbrella. So I would like to see, and what we hope is that this book is a starting point, which will lead to a lot of new and innovative and engaging scholarship. We don't see this as the last word at all. In fact, we really see this as something that we hope will lead to lots of synergies of scholarship to create more insight into this subject.
And
Cheryl, what's your take on that?
Yeah. I want to, just one more point. These abolitionist ship captains are starting to raise our suspicions. And I was reviewing Tubman's case for this, and Kate says that she's getting passes from these ship's captains. We see Drayton talking about the same thing in the Escape from the Pearl. We see Winona Judge, John Bowles helps her escape. We don't understand whether these are all individuals acting individually, whether this is a collective mindset that's happening from these northern ships. And Drayton he touches on it when he says that the people who are escaping can they recognize something about the boats, whether it's the colors, the flags, there's something that they see that tells them that this is probably a ship I can board. So I think that understanding who these captains are is important. And if this is, how they are perceiving their work, it is no accident that countless ads warn these captains of vessels not to take on people escaping slavery. And the slaveholder spends a lot of money telling us this in these ads. Go ahead, Rick.
I was just going to say, I'm glad both of you sort of raised questions about whether or not captains are aware of the stowaways or not, right? That's one of the questions we've got from one of the participants here. But I want to jump around a little bit because we've got questions coming in from all directions here. One of the participants is a naval historian at the United States Naval Academy, Roger Bailey. And Dr. Bailey's asking about the US Navy, if they play any role in, for lack of a better word, the suppression of the saltwater underground. At a certain point, the US Navy becomes involved in the suppression of the Atlantic slave trade. What about the saltwater underground? Roger's question is, to what extent were federal officials searching for fugitives on the water? Was the US Revenue Marine Service involved? And John Muller's asking about whether the presence of the US Navy yards in Washington, D.C. and other cities have any bearing on patterns of activity or suppression.
So to the best of my knowledge, during the period that we're talking about, a couple of things are going on. One is that there's a very active maritime transport of enslaved people from the northern part of the South to the deep South. And so, there have been recent works written about the U.S. Internal slave trade that's carried on by water, with, I think the figure is 1.2 million people transferred from the northern southern states to the deep South. And so I don't know that there's much regulation or boarding of vessels there. I don't think that the U.S. Customs Service or the U.S. Navy is playing any role in American waters, except that in places like Charlestown Navy Yard and northern naval bases, we have records of mariners of color, some of whom are almost certainly fugitives, signing aboard to be crew aboard ships like the USS Constitution and other large naval vessels that operated out of northern ports. And so they managed to get freeman's papers and then sailed as crew. But in terms of an enforcement role, I don't think so. Not in U.S. waters prior to the Civil War. That said, it is a U.S. I think it's a customs vessel that intercepts the Amistad and takes it into, and the captain has to make a decision in 1836 or 38 so they're in Long Island Sound, and the captain has to decide whether he's going to take this vessel to Connecticut, which is a free state, or to New York, which is not a free state at the time. And he, being sympathetic to the abolitionist cause, decides that the enslaved people on board will get a better chance of a fair trial if he takes them to Connecticut, and he does that. So, I gave you a two-sided answer.
But you know what I would also say? What we know about this kind of thing is that it may well be happening and that the Navy may be involved, but that it is not discussed in a collective way. And that it may well be inside of the maritime literature within the Navy, where someone is saying, I encountered this ship or I confiscated this person, but it's a singular event that doesn't get then looked at or anybody thinks it's important. It's probably in the maritime literature for the Navy. But you have to go looking for it specifically to highlight it because it's going to be part of a larger report talking about something else.
Right. And to Cheryl's point about whether or not there's any collusion between ship masters that are carrying contraband enslaved persons who are seeking freedom to the north, this is a situation where there's almost never a paper trail.
Exactly.
Because it's clandestine activity and it's illegal, and the costs of being caught are really high. And so we don't have much in the historical record that helps us to suss out these issues.
So let me just pick up on that last point. But before I do, I'm going to put on my professor hat for just 2 minutes in case anyone missed Tim's reference to New York not being a free state at that period in history. We often think, maybe too reflexively, of the free North and the slave South and Mason-Dixon between Pennsylvania and Maryland as being the dividing line. That eventually becomes true in some legal sense, but it's a long time coming. The the colonies, all 13 colonies have slavery legalized before the American Revolution. There is slavery in New Hampshire. There is slavery in Massachusetts, where Tim's sitting right now. He's not actually in Lisbon, which is where his background is. There is slavery in Pennsylvania. There's slavery in New York, slavery in New Jersey. And each of those states will take action after the Revolution to dismantle slavery. But in most places north of Maryland, it's an agonizingly slow process, often a legal process known as gradual emancipation or gradual abolition, which often means slavery is on a 30 or 40-year glide path to being outlawed. So New York doesn't even begin that process until 1799, incredibly late compared to Pennsylvania, almost 20 years earlier. And that's when the clock starts of that 30 to 40 glide path. So as Tim said, you can still find slavery effectively legalized in some parts of the North way into the 19th century. Anyway, hat off.
Plus, I will tell you that my neighbors and people that I encounter who ask me about my work are shocked when I tell them that Maryland is a slave state. I'm
Right.
telling you, down on the ground, that's the other piece to what you're saying.
So thank you for that. Yes, hopefully this crowd is well aware of that if they've been coming to these events regularly enough. One more follow-up here, and this comes back to something both of you said a moment ago. One of our anonymous attendees wants to know, what do you think the success rate was for maritime fugitivity? I get questions like this about the success rate of the Underground Railroad, and I sort of stare off into the distance and go into my happy place, because it's a really hard question to answer. Tell us why it's a really hard question to answer.
Cheryl, you want to take a first stab at it, or shall I?
Yeah, why don't you go ahead? Because I want to stare off into space.
Okay, all right. So it's a wonderful question. We all would love to be able to answer that question. The success rate. So I'll say this: if we just go by known, documentable, successful escapes, almost all of the ones from the far south happened by water. And almost all of the known successful terrestrial escapes that happen and are recorded, almost all of them began just a few miles from the border with a free state. A handful of miles, a distance you could walk in a day or two. This means that almost all successful escapes from the far south are happening by water. Now, are there instances that are known of people getting caught trying to escape by water? Absolutely. We would have very little way of knowing. Put another way, it's easier to find out information about people who were caught running away than it is to find out about people who were successful. Because if they were successful, they were very unlikely to talk about it for a number of reasons. The biggest one after 1850 is that they were subject to re-enslavement if they were still in the United States. And so most of the information that we have about this isn't published and known until after the Civil War. And so if I were to hazard a guess at a percentage of success, I wouldn't hazard that guess, because it's almost impossible to say. But what we do have is, as I said before, 70% of published accounts of runaway slave narratives, 70% mention water as a form of escape, seaborne escapes, and a very high percentage of the population of New Bedford in the census of 1836. The census of 1830 and 1840. A very high percentage of African Americans living in the city of New Bedford at that time mentioned the South as their place of birth. It's above 40%. And the chances of them being born into circumstances of freedom in the South and then ending up in New Bedford are pretty low. Chances are that they were born into enslavement and then made their way north and were operating as a free person living in a city that was particularly known for abolitionism and that was known for providing opportunities for labor and to make a living to people who had escaped enslavement. So the story of New Bedford is a really important one, and it's actually a pretty central part of the book. So if you're interested in that, then I encourage you to look at the chapters about Massachusetts that are in the book.
And I'm just keeping an eye on time here. We have to wrap right here. So let me just ask either of you, we're getting a lot of requests, where can I find this book? Where can I buy this book? If I want a signed copy, what can I do? What do you say to these excitable consumers?
Right. If you are capable of sending out to all of the registered people for this, I'll give you a code where they can order the book at a 40% discount. 30% discount and free shipping, which is pretty good. So I'll send that out. And if you can disseminate that to anyone who registered, then I'd be very grateful. If people are interested in getting a signed copy, if you email me at my university email address, I will send you a book plate, an adhesive book plate with my signature, and you can put it in the book. And you'll have to talk to Cheryl individually for that service too. But I'm happy to do that to anyone who wants a signed copy.
I'd be happy to do the same. I like that idea. I hadn't thought about it.
That's very generous. And folks can find Tim Walker's email address just by Googling University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth, Timothy Walker. He's a public figure, unfortunately, for better or worse, as we all are.
But let me send the code for, it's published by UMass Press. So I'll send that out and you can disseminate that to the folks who are registered.
Good. Well, we have lots of great feedback coming into the chat, commending both of you for this wonderful presentation. So thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us, folks. I do hope you track down the book, either at your local public library or from the University of Massachusetts Press or from your local independent bookstore, wherever that may be. So I will hand things back to Margot and just say on my behalf, thanks very much to both of you.
Thank you. This was great. It was fun.
Thank you so much for having us. It's wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Rick, Timothy, and Cheryl for joining us today. And thank you everyone out there for joining us. We wrapped up just on time and have a great rest of your year. We'll see you next year.
Thank you.